The hospital called at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday to tell me my daughter had been in a terrible accident. A fall down the stairs, they said. Those words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs and making my knees buckle against my kitchen counter. When I saw Sarah lying in that hospital bed, my beautiful 32-year-old daughter looked like a broken doll. Her face was a canvas of purple and black bruises, tubes snaking from her arms, machines beeping their mechanical rhythm around her still form. The smell of antiseptic couldn't mask the metallic scent of blood, and the fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her swollen features. But it was when she opened her eyes and saw me that my world truly collapsed. She whispered, her voice barely audible through cracked lips. "It wasn't an accident. He pushed me." Those 6 words changed everything. My son-in-law Marcus, the man I'd welcomed into our family, the father of my future grandchildren, had tried to murder my daughter. When I stumbled to the nurse's station later, desperate to understand the paperwork, to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around me, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. There, on the admission forms, was Marcus's signature. But it wasn't the frantic scrawl of a panicked husband whose wife had nearly died. It was calm, controlled, practiced. The same steady handwriting he used to sign Christmas cards and business documents. A guilty man's hands shake, a grieving man's signature trembles with emotion. But Marcus had signed those forms with the clinical detachment of someone conducting routine business. That signature was as steady as a surgeon's hand, as composed as a man who'd been expecting this exact moment. In that instant, standing in that sterile hospital corridor, with those forms in my trembling hands, I understood the horrible truth. This wasn't a tragic accident that had blindsided a loving husband. This was a calculated attempt at murder, planned and executed by the man who'd promised to love and protect my daughter until death do them part. That signature told me everything I needed to know. It revealed a killer's composure, a predator's patience, and most chillingly, a complete absence of surprise or genuine grief. This is how a mother's intuition exposed a calculated attempt at murder and how I made sure justice would be served. Before I tell you how I unraveled my son-in-law's deadly deception, if you believe in the power of a mother's love to seek justice, please subscribe to hear more stories like this one. Sometimes the most ordinary people are forced to become extraordinary when the ones we love are threatened, and these stories need to be told. Now let me take you back to that ordinary Tuesday afternoon when my world shattered, because understanding how it began is crucial to understanding how I made sure it ended with the truth. My name is Eleanor Henderson. I'm 68 years old, a retired high school English teacher, and a widow of 7 years. People often tell me I have sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, qualities that served me well in the classroom and would prove invaluable in the days to come. That Tuesday had been perfectly ordinary, the kind of peaceful afternoon I'd grown to treasure in my retirement. I was standing in my sunny kitchen, stirring a pot of chicken soup, Sarah's favorite since childhood, and planning our weekly dinner together. The rain drummed gently against my windows, and I remember thinking how cozy it would be when she arrived, both of us warming up with soup and catching up on our week. The phone's harsh ring shattered that tranquil moment like glass. "Mrs. Henderson, this is Mercy General Hospital. Your daughter, Sarah Williams, has been in an accident." The 20-minute drive to the hospital passed in a blur of windshield wipers and desperate prayers. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, and every red light felt like an eternity. I kept telling myself that everything would be fine, that Sarah was strong, that accidents happen and people recover. But when I arrived at the emergency room, I saw Marcus standing near the information desk, and something in my maternal instincts immediately recoiled. He was too composed, too controlled. While I was trembling and barely coherent with worry, he stood there checking his phone with the casual air of someone waiting for a business appointment. His eyes, when they met mine, held no genuine grief, no fear, no desperation of a man whose wife had nearly died. In that moment, I knew something was terribly, dangerously wrong. Before that phone call, my kitchen had been my sanctuary. The afternoon light filtered through yellow curtains I'd sewn myself 40 years ago, casting everything in a warm golden glow. Steam rose from the soup pot in lazy spirals, carrying the scent of carrots and celery and love, the same recipe my mother had taught me, the one Sarah had requested every time she felt sick or sad since she was 5 years old. I had been humming while I stirred, thinking about how Sarah's face would light up when she tasted it. We'd planned to discuss her upcoming birthday, maybe look through old photo albums like we did every month. These simple rituals had become even more precious since my husband Robert passed 7 years ago. Sarah was all I had left, my anchor in a world that sometimes felt too quiet, too empty. The wooden spoon was still in my hand when the phone rang. Such an ordinary object, worn smooth by decades of use, suddenly felt impossibly heavy as the nurse's clinical voice delivered words that would change everything. Serious injuries, emergency surgery, come immediately. I dropped that spoon, and it clattered to the floor like a gunshot in the sudden silence. My knees buckled, and I had to grip the counter to keep from falling. The soup continued to simmer, oblivious to the fact that the world had just tilted off its axis. The rain that had seemed so peaceful moments before now sounded like nature itself was weeping. In the space of 30 seconds, my cozy kitchen transformed from a haven of maternal love into the last place I would ever feel truly safe again. The drive to Mercy General Hospital remains burned into my memory like a scar. Every red light was torture. Every slow car in front of me an insurmountable obstacle between me and my daughter. Rain hammered my windshield so hard the wipers could barely keep up, turning the world into a watercolor painting running down glass. My hands shook so violently I could barely grip the steering wheel. At one point, I had to pull over because my vision blurred with tears and panic, and I couldn't tell where the road ended and the storm began. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, taking deep breaths and whispering the same prayer over and over. Please, God, let her be okay. Please don't take her from me too. The radio played soft jazz, completely inappropriate for the emergency tearing through my chest. I reached over and shut it off, needing silence to think, to prepare myself for whatever waited at the hospital. But the quiet only made room for my mind to conjure worst-case scenarios. Scenarios that, as I would later discover, weren't nearly as terrible as the actual truth. I thought about all the times Sarah had fallen as a child. Off her bicycle when she was 7, down the basement stairs when she was 12 while chasing our cat. Each time, I'd been there to kiss her scrapes and promise everything would be fine. This felt different, catastrophically different, but I clung to my role as mother and protector. I would fix this somehow. I would make it better. When I finally reached the hospital parking lot, I nearly crashed into a concrete barrier in my haste. The building loomed before me like a fortress of glass and steel, its windows glowing against the stormy sky. People moved in and out of the automatic doors with purpose I envied. They weren't running toward their worst nightmare made real. I stumbled across the parking lot, rain soaking through my cardigan and plastering my gray hair to my scalp. Each step felt like walking through quicksand, and my heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst. The automatic doors whooshed open, and the smell of disinfectant and fear hit me like a physical wall. Somewhere in this building was my broken daughter, and I was about to discover that the man who'd sworn to protect her was the one who'd tried to destroy her. The ICU was a maze of beeping machines and hushed voices, where hope and despair hung in the air like competing perfumes. Nurse Susan, a kind woman with gentle eyes, led me through corridors that seemed to stretch forever. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, and I had to keep touching the wall to steady myself. He's stable, Susan kept saying, but the word felt hollow when I saw what stable actually meant. Sarah lay in room 314, dwarfed by the enormous hospital bed like a child playing dress-up in adult clothes. But there was nothing playful about the sight that greeted me. My vibrant, laughing daughter, the one who'd called me just 2 days ago excited about a promotion at work, was barely recognizable. Purple bruises bloomed across her face like hideous flowers, so dark and extensive that her features were grotesquely swollen. Her left eye was sealed shut, and her bottom lip was split and crusted with dried blood. Tubes snaked from her arms to machines that blinked and hummed with electronic urgency. The heart monitor's steady beeping should have been comforting, proof of life, but instead it felt like a countdown timer. Her breathing was shallow, labored, each exhale a visible effort that made my own chest tighten in sympathy. Bandages wrapped her head like a white turban, and I could see the edges where they'd had to shave away her beautiful auburn hair, the same color as mine had been at her age. "My little girl," I whispered, sinking into the bedside chair that someone had positioned exactly where a mother would need it. "What did he do to you?" The worst part wasn't the visible injuries, though they were horrifying enough. It was how small she looked, how fragile. Sarah had always been my strong one, the daughter who'd moved across the country for college without a tear, who'd started her own business at 28, who'd never met a challenge she couldn't conquer. Seeing her reduced to this broken shell felt like watching the sun go out. Dr. Martinez appeared beside me, clipboard in hand, rattling off medical terms that meant nothing to my terrified mind. Fractured ribs, subdural hematoma, internal bleeding. But certain phrases cut through my shock like knives. Significant trauma, multiple impact points, pattern of injuries inconsistent with a simple fall. It was then that Sarah's eyes fluttered open. Just her right eye, since the left remained swollen shut. When she saw me, something that might have been relief crossed her battered features. Her lips moved, and I leaned closer, straining to hear her whispered words over the mechanical symphony of her life support. "Mom," she breathed, her voice barely audible but urgent with desperate need. "It wasn't accident. He pushed me. Marcus. He tried to kill me." And in that moment, my world didn't just change, it shattered completely, like glass hitting concrete, leaving nothing but razor-sharp fragments where my trust and safety used to be. Sarah's confession came in fragments, whispered between labored breaths and punctuated by the relentless beeping of machines. Each word was a struggle, but she fought to tell me everything before the medication pulled her back under, or before Marcus returned. "He's been planning this," she managed, her one good eye fixed on mine with desperate intensity. "Found divorce papers. I hid them. He went crazy." The story emerged like pieces of a horrific puzzle. Marcus had been having an affair with Lisa Martinez, his 28-year-old secretary. Sarah had discovered credit card statements showing expensive dinners, hotel rooms, jewelry she'd never received. When she'd confronted him 3 weeks ago, he'd laughed it off, promising to end it. But Sarah wasn't naive. She'd hired a private investigator. "The photos," she whispered, wincing as speaking caused her obvious pain. "Lisa, wearing my grandmother's ring, the one he said was stolen." But the affair was just the surface. Sarah had found evidence that Marcus had been systematically draining their joint accounts, forging her signature on investment documents that were actually gambling debts. He owed nearly $200,000 to people who didn't accept excuses or payment plans. "Life insurance," Sarah breathed, her grip on my hand surprisingly strong despite her condition. "He doubled it. 3 months ago. 500,000 if I die accidentally." The final piece was the most chilling. Tuesday morning, Sarah had found the divorce papers she'd hidden and discovered Marcus had seen them. The attorney's business card was missing, and Marcus's laptop showed he'd been researching her lawyer, her accounts, even her daily routines. "He cornered me." "At the top of the stairs," she continued, each word costing her tremendous effort. "Said accidents happen to wives who ask too many questions." His eyes, Mom. They were so cold, like looking at a stranger. Sarah described how Marcus had grabbed her shoulders, how his face had transformed into something predatory and calculating. He said Lisa was pregnant, said he needed to be free. Then he just pushed. The most terrifying detail was what happened after. Marcus had stood at the top of the stairs for several minutes, not calling for help, just watching her broken body at the bottom. Only when he was certain she was unconscious, possibly dead, had he finally called 911. He practiced. What to tell them, she whispered, her eye beginning to flutter closed. He'd heard him, rehearsing in the bathroom, before he left for work. Then the medication claimed her again, leaving me alone with the devastating truth that my son-in-law was a calculating murderer. I sat with Sarah for nearly an hour, processing the horror of what she'd told me, before realizing I needed to understand the official version of events. My teacher's instincts kicked in, the same methodical approach I'd used to solve classroom mysteries and grade papers fairly. Evidence mattered. Documentation mattered. Truth had a way of revealing itself if you knew how to look. The nurse's station buzzed with controlled activity, charts being updated, phones ringing with medical consultations. Susan looked up when I approached, her expression immediately sympathetic. "I need to see the admission forms," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "I need to understand what happened." She hesitated for a moment, protocol and privacy regulations warring with basic human compassion, before sliding a clipboard across the counter. "Family members have a right to see these," she said gently. "Take your time." The forms were typical hospital bureaucracy, medical history, insurance information, emergency contacts, but it was the signature page that made my blood turn to Arctic ice. There, in black ink, was Marcus Williams's name, signed with the same careful precision he used on birthday cards and business contracts. I stared at that signature for a full minute, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't the frantic scrawl of a man whose world had just collapsed. There was no tremor of shock, no evidence of the devastating grief that should have been coursing through his system. The letters were perfectly formed, evenly spaced, professionally composed. As a teacher for 40 years, I'd learned to read far more than just words on a page. I'd graded papers written during panic attacks and seen how stress affected handwriting. I'd watched students sign disciplinary forms with shaking hands when they were truly upset about their actions. Human beings under extreme emotional duress simply cannot control their fine motor skills with this level of precision. But there was more. I pulled out my own signature from the visitor log I'd signed just minutes earlier. My handwriting looked like it had been produced during an earthquake, letters slanting at impossible angles, ink pressure varying wildly as my hand shook with maternal terror. This was what genuine shock looked like on paper. Marcus's signature, by contrast, looked like it had been written during a routine business meeting. Every stroke was deliberate, controlled, practiced. This was the signature of a man who had been expecting this exact moment, who had mentally rehearsed signing these precise forms. The timestamp made it even worse. Marcus had signed these documents at 2:47 p.m. According to the EMT report, they'd received the 911 call at 2:15 p.m. and arrived at the house at 2:22 p.m. Sarah had been transported to the hospital at 2:35 p.m. Marcus had somehow beaten the ambulance to the hospital and completed all the paperwork before I'd even received the phone call at 3:47 p.m. How does a frantic husband, supposedly discovering his wife's broken body, manage to follow an ambulance through city traffic and calmly complete insurance forms in less than 30 minutes? How does a man in genuine shock produce handwriting that looks like a corporate executive approving a merger? "Mrs. Henderson?" Susan's voice broke through my analysis. "Are you all right? You look pale." I looked up at her, that damning signature still clutched in my trembling hands. "This signature," I said slowly. "When did my son-in-law arrive at the hospital?" "He was already here when the ambulance arrived," she replied. "Said he'd followed them from the house. Very composed gentleman, very helpful with the paperwork." Very composed, that was the problem. That signature was Marcus's confession, written in his own hand, proof that he'd approached his wife's near death with the emotional detachment of a man conducting routine business. Marcus arrived at the hospital 45 minutes after I did, making his entrance with the theatrical precision of an actor taking the stage. He swept through the ICU doors carrying an enormous bouquet of white lilies, funeral flowers, I realized with a chill, and wearing his most expensive charcoal suit. For a man who'd supposedly discovered his wife's broken body just hours earlier, he looked remarkably put together. "Eleanor," he said, embracing me with practiced sympathy, "I'm so sorry you had to see her like this. It's just devastating." But his performance felt hollow, like watching a community theater actor recite lines he'd memorized but didn't truly understand. His eyes remained dry while mine were red and swollen from crying. His hands were steady while mine still trembled uncontrollably. Most telling of all, he kept checking his Apple Watch throughout our conversation, as if he had somewhere more important to be. When Dr. Martinez appeared to discuss Sarah's condition, Marcus transformed into a corporate executive conducting a business meeting. He pulled out a leather portfolio and took notes while the doctor explained the extent of her injuries, asking questions about prognosis timelines and long-term care requirements, with the detached professionalism of someone calculating costs, rather than grieving a beloved spouse. "What are the chances of full recovery?" he asked, pen poised over his notepad. "And if there are complications, what kind of care facilities would we be looking at?" I watched his face carefully during the doctor's explanations. When Dr. Martinez mentioned that Sarah's memory might be affected by the head trauma, that she might not remember the events leading up to her fall, a flicker of something that looked suspiciously like relief crossed Marcus's features. The most chilling moment came when he visited Sarah's bedside. He leaned over her unconscious form and whispered, "I'm so sorry this happened to you, sweetheart. If only you'd been more careful on those stairs." His tone was gentle, loving even, but I caught the subtle emphasis on the word careful. A reminder, a threat, a promise that his version of events was the only one that mattered. When he kissed her forehead, I noticed he was careful to avoid her bruises. Not out of tenderness, but because he seemed to know exactly where they were, as if he'd placed them there himself. "Thank God she's unconscious," he murmured to me as we left her room. "At least she's not suffering." But I wondered if he was more grateful that she couldn't speak. I drove home through the rain in a daze, my mind cycling between maternal grief and growing suspicion. Everything about Marcus's behavior felt wrong, calculated, rehearsed. But suspicion without evidence was just paranoia, and I needed facts. 40 years of teaching had trained me to investigate thoroughly before drawing conclusions. My first call was to Mrs. Patterson, Sarah and Marcus's elderly neighbor. Dorothy Patterson was 83, sharp as a tack, and had the kind of curiosity that comes from living alone, with little entertainment beyond observing her neighborhood. "Oh, Eleanor," she said when she heard my voice. "I've been sick with worry since I heard the ambulance. How is our sweet Sarah?" I explained the situation carefully, then asked if she'd noticed anything unusual that afternoon. There was a long pause before Dorothy spoke again, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Well, I didn't want to seem like a busybody, but there was quite a commotion around 1:30. Raised voices, you know. They don't usually fight where folks can hear, but this was different, angrier." My heart began racing. "What did you hear exactly?" Sarah was crying, asking him about some woman named Lisa. Then Marcus got loud, really loud, said something about Sarah being too nosy for her own good. Then there was this awful sound, like something heavy hitting the stairs, and then silence. Complete silence for maybe 10 minutes before the ambulance came. Dorothy's timeline didn't match Marcus's story at all. He'd claimed he found Sarah after returning from a client meeting, but Dorothy had heard him in the house during the argument. "Did you see Marcus leave the house?" I asked. "That's the strange thing. His car was in the driveway the whole time. He didn't leave until after the ambulance took Sarah away. Then he followed them, driving like a maniac." After hanging up with Dorothy, I drove to Sarah's house using the spare key she'd given me years ago. The police had finished their brief investigation. After all, it was just a tragic accident, according to Marcus's statement. and the house felt eerily quiet. I climbed the stairs carefully, studying the scene with new eyes. The carpet at the top was disturbed, showing signs of a struggle. There were scuff marks on the hardwood where Sarah might have tried to brace herself. Most telling of all, I found a small chunk of auburn hair caught on the banister. Torn out, not fallen naturally. In Sarah's home office, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Hidden behind her computer tower was a manila envelope containing documents that painted a terrifying picture of Marcus's financial desperation. Bank statements showed he'd been systematically draining their accounts for months. Credit reports revealed gambling debts totaling nearly $200,000. Most damning of all was a life insurance application dated 3 months ago, doubling Sarah's coverage to $500,000. But the smoking gun was tucked inside Sarah's jewelry box, a small digital recorder she'd apparently been using to document Marcus's increasingly erratic behavior. The final recording was dated just 2 days before her accident. Marcus's voice was clear and menacing. "You think you're so smart with your little investigations, Sarah. But accidents happen to wives who don't know when to stop asking questions." I had found my proof. Now I needed to figure out how to use it. Sitting in Sarah's violated home office, I realized that my decades of teaching had prepared me for this moment in ways I'd never imagined. I'd spent 40 years learning to read people, detecting lies in homework excuses, recognizing when students were hiding abuse at home, understanding the subtle signs that distinguish genuine remorse from calculated manipulation. Marcus had made the classic mistake of underestimating his opponent. He saw a grieving mother, an elderly widow who could be easily manipulated and controlled. He didn't see the woman who'd managed classroom dynamics for 4 decades, who'd dealt with manipulative teenagers and their equally manipulative parents, who'd learned to trust her instincts when something didn't add up. I'd witnessed enough family crises to recognize the pattern. Marcus's behavior matched every abusive spouse I'd encountered through my students over the years. The same calculated charm, the same ability to compartmentalize violence, the same narcissistic certainty that he was smarter than everyone around him. But I also understood something Marcus didn't. Patience was a weapon, and at 68, I had learned to wield it masterfully. He was operating on desperation and adrenaline, making mistakes because he needed this crisis resolved quickly. I could afford to be methodical, careful, strategic. My first strategic decision was to let Marcus believe his performance was working. When he called that evening to check on me, I played the part of the confused, grieving mother-in-law who accepted his version of events without question. "I just can't understand how she fell," I said, injecting my voice with the right amount of bewildered sorrow. "She's always been so careful on those stairs." "Accidents happen, Eleanor," he replied, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Sarah's been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe she was distracted, maybe she was rushing. We'll never really know." But while I played the fool, I was building my case systematically. I photocopied every document I'd found, storing the originals safely in my own home. I transcribed Dorothy Patterson's account word for word, noting exact times and details. I researched Marcus's business associates, discovering a pattern of failed investments and questionable financial decisions. Most importantly, I reached out to my niece Jessica, a family law attorney in Chicago who specialized in domestic violence cases. Without revealing too many details over the phone, I asked her about the legal requirements for building a case against someone who'd attempted murder but made it look like an accident. "Aunt Eleanor," she said, her voice concerned, "this sounds serious. Are you in some kind of danger?" "Not me," I replied carefully, "but someone I love might be. If, hypothetically, someone tried to kill their spouse and make it look accidental, what kind of evidence would prosecutors need?" Jessica's legal expertise proved invaluable. She explained the importance of establishing motive, means, and opportunity. She told me about the kind of evidence that would hold up in court versus the kind that could be dismissed as circumstantial. Most crucially, she warned me about the statute of limitations and the importance of acting quickly. "If this is really happening," she said, Document everything, get witnesses on record, and whatever you do, don't confront the perpetrator directly. Desperate people do desperate things. But confrontation was exactly what I was planning. Because I understood something Jessica couldn't. Sometimes the only way to catch a predator is to make yourself the prey. 3 days after Sarah's accident, I walked into First National Bank armed with the power of attorney documents Sarah had given me years earlier. A precaution we'd taken after my husband's sudden death taught us both the importance of having someone who could access accounts in an emergency. I never imagined I'd be using them to investigate attempted murder. Jennifer Walsh, the branch manager who'd handled Sarah and Marcus's accounts for 6 years, greeted me with the kind of professional sympathy reserved for family emergencies. But when I explained what I needed to see, her expression shifted from sympathy to alarm. "Mrs. Henderson," she said carefully, "I need to be very clear about what I'm showing you. These transactions, they're concerning." The computer screen revealed a financial bloodbath. Over the past 18 months, Marcus had systematically drained their joint savings account, their vacation fund, even Sarah's individual retirement account that required both signatures for withdrawal. The forged signatures were obvious once you knew what to look for. Sarah's naturally flowing handwriting replaced by Marcus's more angular style, attempting to mimic hers but failing under close examination. "We flagged several of these transactions," Jennifer admitted, pulling up additional screens. "But Mr. Williams provided documentation that seemed legitimate at the time. Business investment opportunities," he said, "time-sensitive deals that required immediate action." The investment opportunities were fiction. Every dollar had gone to pay gambling debts, fund his affair with Lisa, or disappear into offshore accounts I couldn't trace. Sarah's hard-earned teacher's salary, her inheritance from her grandmother, the savings she'd built for their future children, all of it sacrificed to feed Marcus's addictions and ambition. But the most damning revelation was the life insurance policy. Marcus had not only doubled Sarah's coverage 3 months ago, he'd also added an accidental death clause that would pay an additional $250,000 if she died in an accident, rather than from illness. The timing wasn't coincidental, it was calculated. "Did Mr. Williams seem nervous when he made these changes?" I asked Jennifer. "Actually, no, he was quite cheerful, almost excited. Said they were planning for the future, talking about starting a family. He joked about wanting to make sure Sarah would be well taken care of if anything happened to him. But the policy only covered Sarah's death, not his. Marcus had been planning her murder for months, building the financial motive while establishing himself as the grieving beneficiary. In his mind, $750,000 would solve all his problems, pay off his debts, fund his new life with Lisa, and eliminate the wife who'd become inconveniently aware of his crimes. Finding Lisa Martinez required less detective work than I'd expected. Marcus had been careless in his arrogance, leaving a trail of digital breadcrumbs that led straight to his mistress. A receipt in his jacket pocket, which I'd found while helping him gather clothes for Sarah at the hospital, showed lunch at an expensive downtown restaurant on the day of Sarah's accident. The credit card statement revealed this was a regular occurrence, always at 11:30 a.m., always for 2 people. I positioned myself across the street from Chez Laurent the following Tuesday, feeling like a character in one of the mystery novels I'd been reading since retirement. At exactly 11:35, Marcus arrived with a stunning young woman who had to be Lisa. Even from a distance, I could see the expensive jewelry adorning her neck and wrists, pieces that looked suspiciously similar to items that had gone missing from Sarah's collection over the past year. Lisa Martinez was everything Sarah wasn't: young, naive, and completely unaware she was dating a murderer. When I followed her after lunch to the coffee shop where she obviously spent her afternoons, I decided to take a calculated risk. "Excuse me," I said, approaching her table with my most grandmotherly smile. "Aren't you Lisa? Marcus has mentioned you so many times." The color drained from her face instantly. I don't know what you mean." But I pressed on, playing the part of the well-meaning family member who'd accidentally stumbled onto their affair. "Oh dear, I hope I haven't said something wrong. I'm Eleanor, Marcus's mother-in-law. He talks about you constantly, his work colleague who's been so supportive during this difficult time." Lisa's guilt was written across her features like a confession. She stammered about being sorry to hear about Sarah's accident, about how Marcus was such a devoted husband who was completely devastated by what had happened. But as our conversation continued, cracks appeared in her facade. She mentioned how Marcus had been planning to leave Sarah anyway, how their marriage had been over for months, how he'd been waiting for the right time to file for divorce. "He said Sarah was becoming unstable," Lisa confided, apparently believing she was talking to an ally. Paranoid, jealous, making wild accusations about money, Marcus was worried she might hurt herself. The most chilling revelation came when Lisa mentioned their future plans. Marcus said once Sarah's situation is resolved, we could finally be together openly. He's already picked out a ring. She was planning a wedding while Sarah lay broken in a hospital bed, completely unaware that her boyfriend was a calculating murderer. That evening, I called Marcus with a performance worthy of an Academy Award. My voice trembled with just the right amount of maternal vulnerability as I asked if he could come over for dinner. "I need to understand what happened to my daughter," I said. "I need to hear it from you, from someone who was there." "Of course, Eleanor," he replied, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "I think it would be good for both of us to talk through this tragedy. Maybe it will help us both find some peace." Peace. The word made my skin crawl coming from his lips. But before Marcus arrived, I had work to do. Jessica had coached me extensively on creating a controlled environment for what she called eliciting admissions. My dining room became a carefully orchestrated stage designed to make Marcus comfortable enough to reveal the truth. I set up my old cassette recorder, the one I'd used for recording parent conferences, inside the antique sideboard where it would capture every word without being visible. My smartphone provided backup recording hidden behind a flower arrangement on the mantel. Jessica had stressed the importance of redundancy. If this evidence is going to court, you can't afford to lose a single word. The dinner menu was strategic too. Marcus's favorite meal, pot roast with all the fixings, designed to make him feel welcomed, trusted, off his guard. I even opened a bottle of his preferred wine, though I planned to barely touch my own glass while encouraging him to drink freely. Most importantly, I prepared emotionally for what was about to happen. I was going to sit across from the man who'd tried to murder my daughter and pretend to believe his lies. I was going to listen to him describe Sarah's accident while knowing he'd orchestrated every detail. I was going to smile and nod while he expressed fake concern for her recovery, all while documenting his confession. The woman who'd spent 40 years teaching teenagers how to be honest and ethical was about to become a master manipulator herself. But as I set the table with my best china and lit candles to create the perfect atmosphere of familial intimacy, I felt no guilt about my deception. Marcus had forgotten a crucial lesson I'd learned in decades of dealing with difficult people. Underestimate a mother protecting her child at your own peril. When the doorbell rang at exactly 7 o'clock, I took a deep breath and prepared to catch a killer. Marcus arrived at my door carrying white roses and wearing his most sympathetic expression, the same mask of concern he'd perfected for the hospital staff. He embraced me with theatrical warmth, playing his role as the devoted son-in-law who'd come to comfort his grieving mother-in-law in our shared time of crisis. "Eleanor, you look exhausted," he said, his voice dripping with false compassion. "This has been so hard on all of us." I led him into my dining room, where the table was set with my grandmother's china and the candles cast dancing shadows across the walls. The recorder hidden in the sideboard was already running, capturing every word, every breath, every telling pause that would follow. "I made your favorite," I said, forcing warmth into my voice. I thought if we could just talk about what happened, maybe I could find some peace with it all." Marcus settled into his chair with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. He complimented the meal, inquired about my health, even asked about my garden, playing the part of the caring family member with consummate skill. But I noticed how his eyes kept darting to the family photos on the mantel, calculating, assessing, always thinking 3 moves ahead. Can't stop thinking about Tuesday afternoon, I said, pouring him a generous glass of wine. It's just so hard to understand how something like this could happen. Accidents are like that, he replied, already reaching for his glass. They happen so quickly, so randomly. One moment everything is normal, and the next... He shook his head with practiced sorrow. I watched him take a long drink, noting how comfortable he seemed discussing his wife's near-death experience. A truly grief-stricken husband would struggle to talk about it at all. But Marcus spoke about Sarah's accident with the detached ease of someone discussing a business transaction. The trap was set. Now I just had to spring it. Tell me exactly what happened, I said, cutting into my pot roast with deliberate slowness. I need to understand the sequence of events. It might help me process this. Marcus leaned back in his chair, wine already loosening his tongue and his guard. Well, I was at the Patterson account meeting until about 1:15. You know how Mr. Patterson can be, always wanting to discuss every detail twice. He chuckled, a sound that made my skin crawl. When I got home, I called out to Sarah, but she didn't answer. I figured she was upstairs, maybe taking a nap. But Dorothy Patterson had already told me his car never left the driveway. Strike one. That's when I heard this awful sound, Marcus continued, his performance gaining momentum. Like something heavy falling, I ran upstairs and found her at the bottom, just broken. He paused for effect, even managing to summon what looked like genuine moisture in his eyes. It must have been such a shock, I murmured sympathetically. How long did it take you to call for help? Immediately, he said without hesitation. Well, after I checked for a pulse, made sure she was breathing. Maybe 2 or 3 minutes total? But the 911 call logs showed a 15-minute gap between when Dorothy heard the accident and when emergency services received Marcus's call. Strike two. The doctors mentioned her injuries were quite severe, I continued, refilling his wine glass. Multiple impact points, they said. Must have been a terrible fall. This was where Marcus made his fatal mistake. His face lit up with the enthusiasm of someone finally able to discuss his handiwork with an appreciative audience. Oh yes, she hit the banister on the way down, then the stairs themselves, then that marble floor at the bottom. It was like watching a rag doll tumble. The clinical detail in his voice was chilling. No grieving husband would describe his wife's fall with such precise, almost gleeful accuracy. But how could you see her fall if you found her afterwards? I asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Marcus's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, his face freezing as he realized what he'd just revealed. For a moment, the mask slipped completely, and I saw the calculating predator underneath. I meant that's what it must have looked like, he stammered, but the damage was done. Based on where she landed, the injuries, I was just trying to piece together what happened. Of course, I agreed, my voice steady despite my racing heart. It's natural to want to understand. Speaking of understanding, I found something interesting when I was helping gather Sarah's things from the house. I reached into the sideboard, the same cabinet hiding my recorder, and pulled out the manila envelope containing all my evidence. Marcus's face went completely white as I spread the contents across the table. Bank statements, insurance documents, photos of him with Lisa, and most damning of all, the small digital recorder Sarah had been using to document his threats. I know you tried to kill my daughter, I said, my voice cutting through the candlelit atmosphere like a blade. I know about the gambling debts, the affair, the life insurance policy. I know you've been planning this for months. Marcus's transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The mask of grief and concern shattered completely, replaced by cold rage and calculating fury. His hands clenched into fists on the table, and for a moment I thought he might try to attack me too. You meddling old woman, he snarled, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You have no idea what you're dealing with. I know exactly what I'm dealing with, I replied, surprised by my own calm. A coward who beats women and calls it an accident. A thief who steals from his own wife. a failure of a man who thought murder was easier than getting a job. He lunged forward, pointing an accusing finger at me. Sarah was going to ruin everything. She found the papers, the accounts, started asking questions. She was going to leave me with nothing. So you decided to leave her with nothing, including her life. It would have been clean, he exploded, abandoning all pretense. One push, a tragic accident, case closed. She would have died instantly if she hadn't grabbed the banister. But no, she had to survive, had to whisper her poison in your ear. The confession poured out of him like water from a broken dam. He detailed how he'd researched Sarah's daily routines, how he'd positioned himself at the top of the stairs when she came up to confront him about the divorce papers. He described the look in her eyes when she realized what he was about to do, the satisfaction he'd felt watching her fall. The insurance money would have solved everything, he continued, seeming almost relieved to finally tell someone about his brilliant plan. Lisa and I could have started fresh, paid off my debts, lived the life we deserved. And Sarah, what did she deserve? Marcus's laugh was pure evil. Sarah deserved exactly what she got. She should have minded her own business. Man. That's when I played the final card. Sarah's recording of his threats from 2 days before the attack. His own voice filled the room. Accidents happen to wives who don't know when to stop asking questions. The look of shocked recognition on his face was worth every terrifying moment of this ordeal. You recorded this whole dinner, didn't you? Marcus asked. His voice suddenly deflated as the full scope of his situation became clear. Every word, I confirmed, just like Sarah recorded your threats, just like the bank recorded your forged signatures, just like the hospital recorded your unnaturally calm demeanor. I reached for my phone and dialed 911. This is Eleanor Henderson at 1247 Maple Street. I need police here immediately. I have a confession to attempted murder, and the suspect is in my dining room. Marcus didn't try to run. Perhaps he finally understood that his web of lies had collapsed completely. Or perhaps he recognized that a 70-year-old woman had just outmaneuvered him so thoroughly that escape was impossible. The police arrived within minutes. I'd called them before Marcus arrived, asking them to wait nearby until I gave the signal. Detective Ray Morrison, who'd initially treated Sarah's case as a simple domestic accident, listened to my recordings with growing amazement. Mrs. Henderson, he said, shaking his head in wonder. This is the most complete confession I've ever seen. He detailed the premeditation, the motive, even the method. Marcus was charged with attempted first-degree murder, insurance fraud, forgery, and domestic violence. The evidence was so overwhelming that his attorney advised him to accept a plea deal rather than face trial. He received 25 years, with the possibility of parole after 15. Sarah made a full recovery, though it took months of physical therapy and counseling. The head injury had affected some of her memories, but she remembered enough to testify at Marcus's sentencing hearing. My mother saved my life, she told the judge, not just by exposing the truth, but by showing me that love is stronger than evil and that justice sometimes wears a grandmother's face. Lisa Martinez, devastated to learn she'd been dating a would-be murderer, cooperated fully with prosecutors and started therapy to understand how she'd been manipulated. They think that because we're older, we're powerless. They see gray hair and assume weak minds. They mistake our kindness for foolishness, our trust for naivety. Marcus made the fatal error of underestimating a mother's love and a teacher's patience. That signature on those hospital forms? So calm, so controlled. Was his confession written in his own hand? It revealed a man who'd approached his wife's near death not with the shattered grief of a loving husband, but with the cold calculation of a killer executing his plan. For 40 years, I taught young people that actions have consequences, that truth always surfaces, that justice may be delayed but never denied. I never imagined I'd have to apply those lessons to save my own daughter's life. A mother's love doesn't age, weaken, or surrender when faced with evil. It transforms into something fierce and unstoppable. When someone threatens our children, we discover reserves of strength we never knew we possessed. We become investigators, warriors, protectors, whatever our children need us to be. Evil counts on our silence, our shock, our willingness to accept the unthinkable, but a mother's intuition, sharpened by decades of reading people and situations, becomes the most powerful weapon against deception. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of love to seek justice and truth to triumph over deception, please subscribe for more incredible tales of survival and courage. These stories matter because they remind us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when the people they love are threatened. Share this with someone who needs to remember their own strength. Tell me in the comments, what clue would you have noticed first? What would you have done differently? Remember, your voice matters, your instincts matter, and sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who save the day. Evil thrives in silence, but love speaks the loudest truth of all.